says, I'm gonna kill you. God says his friends and there's so many things.
I think they did the slow motion. It is something like a. That's right.
Well, and that is a good place, but my closet is like, there's this much room.
Okay. He's going to do a quickie on Stephenville, and he said he would take a break. And he's gonna show my new video lecture that's on Stephenville.
Okay.
And not show it, just put it up there so they can know where the link is and whatnot. Okay. And then I can make a comment or two about it.
So you did something like perfect.
I do, but I don't wanna do this for a
All right, guys, let's go get started. Try to kick this thing off so before too much time goes by. Welcome to the January meeting of MUFON. Does everybody here know what MUFON is? I have been told that not everybody does, and some people after some of the meetings have come up and wanted a few terms explained. So,
Squeeze your name in there.
Billy reminded me to do that today. My name is Tom. I'm the state section director for Section 2, which is the section you're in right now. For those of you that don't know, MUFON stands for the Mutual UFO Network. This is the Dallas-Fort Worth chapter. The way MUFON is organized, each state has its own leadership. So each state has a state director, assistant state director. Then the states are divided into sections, so you'll have a state section director and then field investigators underneath everybody, as well as members. So that's what MUFON stands for. Its mission is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of mankind, that's a very broad topic. And it has a lot of different meanings depending on where your level of interest is in the phenomenon of UFOs. But there are some terms that I wanted to, Bill was nice enough to make me a list in crayon. So,
Thank you.
So,
This former Marine.
it must have been a former Marine over there, right? Or he might still be a Marine, I don't know, whatever.
I thought you were never not a Marine.
Right, that's why I said former. All right, anyway, so you guys will probably hear, sometimes you'll hear us refer to certain individuals as FIs. That stands for field investigators. So when people join MUFON, if they want to become a field investigator, there's a process for that where you study a manual, take a test, and then apply to the state leadership where you want to be an investigator. From there, now, then they decide which section they want to put you in, if they decide to put you on board as a field investigator. And it's, people can get through that process fairly quickly, but I don't know if there's a time limit on it. I don't think so. Anyway, you'll also hear us talk about experiencers in the ERT, Experiencer Research Team. So experiencers in the UFO field is generally talking about people who have had some sort of an experience with either seeing a UFO or abduction type experiences. There are different levels of it. Sometimes all that stuff starts to sort of cross over into the paranormal realm, so we have to sort that a little bit. Because MUFON we don't investigate paranormal. So if something is deemed to be into that realm, we do have contacts, and each one of our sections, we kind of maintain a group, a contact list of people that we can refer people to if it does cross into that category. But MUFON headquarters they kind of want us to stick to the phenomenon of aerial vehicles, and now of course it's splitting off into undersea stuff and there's a lot of things happening in the field. So if anybody here is not a member of MUFON, then I'd like to encourage you to join the organization. You just get on the website, MUFON.com. There's several different levels of membership. I think the lowest level of membership is about $50-$60 a year or something like that. There are several levels above that depending on how much you want to do or how much stuff you want to read. I think there's even a researcher level where you can, for like several $100s a year, you can have access to more stuff. And they're getting ready to kick off a few more projects that's coming on board, like Project Aquarius and different things. I don't even know, is that one even made public yet? I know it's on the website now.
It's been
You know,
announced, it's not accessible probably until
yeah, it's
maybe,
not full.
later on.
Yeah.
Yeah, they just announced it.
Yeah, so but it's coming online, it'll be out there, it's on the website, you can look that information up. SSDs, I already told you what that is, State Section Director, so each section will have somebody to run that section. And that's it. Any other term? Let's see, MUFON also, within the field investigator community, you have the experiencer research team, so certain people volunteer to do those things. Nowadays they are selected by headquarters. Generally looking for people who have a bit of a background in mental health, and probably a few other disciplines that I'm not completely aware of. I'm not a member of that team. We also have a dive team. We have what's called a CAG, which is a case assistance group. So nowadays, in some of the states that aren't big enough to have a number of field investigators, or they don't have even have a state director, some of these states are just piling up investigations that are not completed. And so they will take certain field investigators that want to do it and work cases from these other states and try to help them get caught up. Like right now, I think Pennsylvania is about, what Melanie said the other day, about 200 cases behind, so they're looking for people to do that. Another group, I'm missing one. CAG, ERT, dive team.
That sounds like.
Seems like there was another one, but I can't remember what it is. Anyway, the bottom line is that for those of us that have been in this a while, we realize that no matter what you think of the topic of UFOs or aliens, abductions, all of those things, most of you here are probably either full-blown believers in one of these topics, or at least you're an open-minded skeptic, right? So I've always sort of thrown myself into that last group as being an open-minded skeptic, because until ET lands in my backyard, I kind of just am open-minded about it and research it and follow the science, so to speak. And that's kind of where we're going as an organization, to try to follow the science. MUFON's been pretty good now about giving us extra tools to work cases and ways to analyze data to try to help prove or disprove, a sighting. But what we do is we investigate these sightings, and then we try to rule that as either an unknown object or something that is known, man-made, known, that kind of thing, or if it's information only or insufficient data, then we categorize those things accordingly. Seems like I'm missing something, but anyway, I do want to encourage any of you who are not members of MUFON to join. But before we move on, I'd like to introduce a couple of people who are here today. Ken, just introduce you. This is Ken Cherry, everyone. Ken was the former state director here at MUFON, probably the longest running state director in MUFON in Texas anyway. I don't know about nationwide, but you were state director here for what, 12, 15 years?
Right.
Probably felt like 30 years,
Yeah.
Ken was the state director during the Stephenville incident, and so he'll be talking to you a little bit more later today on some of that. I'd also like to introduce you to John Egge. John Egge is the current assistant state director. We're lucky enough to have him living here in Tarrant County somewhere, and comes to the meetings, so he helps out here.
Undisclosed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's undisclosed location, right? Gary Neitzel, am I pronouncing your name right? That's close enough. Gary's the former state director and also current section director for section 3, I believe, aren't you?
Section 1.
1, okay. And it was 1, 3. They all run together after a while. Are there any other field investigators here that I'm not familiar with? Okay, go ahead and stand up and introduce you guys, yourselves.
Mark Henderson. I retired from the Air Force 3 years ago. I was way out in Kaufman. I've done about 50 cases.
Okay, excellent.
Larry Roberts, I'm local, I'm still working, and I've done 2 cases.
Okay, so you must have just started. Okay. Whose section are you in?
Yours.
In mine? Well, I'll have to talk to you later. Nobody told me, so. All right. Well, that gives me, I think, 5 field investigators in this section now, so that's good. All right, anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you guys to our speaker for tonight, Daniel Allen Jones. For those of you who've been around the UFO phenomenon for some time, you'll recognize Daniel from YouTube videos. He's got his own site out there called Vortex. Still have that? You probably got a couple more floating around out there that I don't know about.
I think so.
He's written a book or 2. And,
Some on the way.
Huh?
Some on the way.
And some on the way. So Daniel's been very active in both paranormal research, UFO research, the whole field really of this cryptology. Cryptozoology, that's right. Okay. And I'm going to turn this meeting over to him. He is going to do a presentation today on the history of MUFON or UFO, the UFO phenomenon. And then we'll, as we move on, I think some people, Ken, I think, has got some books and stuff over here that you guys can sort through a little bit if you want to buy any of those, so they'll be here. So without further ado, Daniel, I'm going to turn this over to you.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Good to be here with you, everybody. It's cool to be able to kick off this year's first meeting, with some familiar faces. It's great to see some people who I don't think we've gotten together probably in several years, at least, when I was involved with this particular group. We'd get here in this room. Before that, there was another group we used to get together here as well. I can get into that. What I'm going to do is go over some historic cases here in Texas and just some interesting honorable mentions that have to do with the UFO phenomenon throughout the last several decades. And then we're going to have a break point, which we can go and come back in, and then we'll talk about some updates with recent news and just things going on in media and culture in general. So I'm going to start out with just a little introduction on myself, make sure this thing's on. I'm a musician by trade. I'm a private music instructor. That's what I do as my day job. But aside from that, I've been interested in, as Tom said, the unexplained, just a wide variety of unexplained phenomena for well over a decade. I've been researching some of these things. I've been to numerous sites, interviewed a number of people, and thanks to people like Ken, that's a big way how I really just connected with different researchers and a lot of other members who have contributed a great deal of work to these fields of study. So I have a platform where I share my media called The Vortex. It's accessible on social media, YouTube. I'm live streaming right now to our channel so that people who aren't able to be here in person can check that out as well. There's a lot to go through, so I'm going to fly through a few different things. And I'm a musician. Like I said, this is my band. We like to tour all over the galaxy, have a lot of fun. So there's a lot of really cool cultural stuff in here that I'm going to touch upon as well, I think, as the research and the interesting things. I manage this group called the Texas UFO Network. It's on Facebook, and I try to, cross-reference a lot of other things that are going on with other databases. But you can check this out. I shared a lot of the material that I'm going to be discussing on that page as well. And we're going to talk about Texas UFO history. I've given a variety of presentations about this in different ways to kind of depending on whatever the theme might be. So we're going to talk about some historical things. People always wonder, what about aliens or extraterrestrials or encounters with some strange entities and some other things like that. For the purpose of this particular talk, I'm not going to get into those so much as just UFO sightings and cases like that. But when we get into a little bit later on some of the updates, we can talk about some of those things as well. Of course, a lot of times people ask about the chupacabra. There I am with my colleague Ken Gerhardt. He's a volunteer at the San Antonio Zoo, where they actually have a pretty cool exhibit on the chupacabra where they tell about some of the history and things. So people wonder, is this some sort of alien hybrid, or does that have anything to do with UFO sightings? It's an interesting idea, but I'm not really going to be getting into that a whole lot either. But there are some things that people kind of wonder about when it comes to mystery creatures. So it's something I think is a bit of an associated field, but we're going to stick mainly to UFOs. when it comes to sightings and other cases. This goes way back, as many of you probably know. The 1800s are full of strange accounts of weird history and mystery lights and airships and things. Here in the state, there are numerous records of things, but I wanted to point out one of the interesting instances in a Denison Daily News report of a farmer named John Martin, North Dallas, basically described an object he saw moving, and he said at one point it came a lot closer and appeared to be the shape of a saucer. So this is one of the first instances where you have a UFO being described as a saucer, well before Kenneth Arnold in 47, with the crescent-shaped objects he saw, and then media kind of spun that into flying saucers, where we get that nomenclature now. One of the other interesting light phenomena that we see is out in Marfa, Texas. How many of you guys have ever been to Marfa or seen the lights? Quite a few. That's pretty cool. So it's one of the places that I think is interesting because it's not a one-time thing. It's not a place where someone saw something once and then it's just kind of gone down into history. But you can actively go there and pretty much any time of the year and probably see these strange lights. Now, by including this, I'm not saying that these, I think, are flying saucers or alien spaceships. Admittedly, I don't know what they are, and I don't think a lot of people really do, but they are still an ongoing mystery which you can still observe frequently rather than just a one-time occurrence where someone saw something in the sky. They have a lot of cool plaques out there with information. The earliest, at least recorded sighting was in 1883 by Robert Ellison, and a cowboy out there who recorded it just to show that they had been seen for a number of years leading up to that as well. They thought that maybe they were some kind of ghost fires or that they were natives out there that tried to ride out and couldn't really ever find anything, but they're still seen today. The most conventional explanation is that they're car headlights or they're reflecting car headlights. There are cars out there and you can mistake what I think are the authentic lights for car headlights, but I think it's very obvious when you get to see them. And of course, videos sometimes don't do it justice because it's always dark, but there is an interesting light phenomenon out there. It's not way, way up in the sky, it's way out in the desert, and sometimes there are multiple lights. You can see some pop in and out, and they all move in synchronistic motion. It's very odd. And these are some that I captured a few years ago. The top one is a group of 4, and then the middle one is something that looked like one that split into 2, and the bottom is one that was exposed over about a minute that seemed to be changing colors. I don't know if that was at the time my camera trying to interpret the light frequencies or what, but there's something interesting going on out there that I think is still tangible, and whether it's a genuine anomalous phenomena or it's just some kind of geomagnetic, geophysical phenomena, I think it's still interesting, and we can still learn from things like this that we have recorded history about going further back than at least modern cases of UFOs. Another really interesting series that were a rash of sightings took place during the Great Airship Mystery in the late 1800s. The Dallas Morning News was one of many newspapers that wrote extensively about these. They referred to it in this edition as the Great Aerial Wanderer. And they included over a dozen different airship stories in this edition on the 19th of April, 1897. And this is at a time where there were a few dirigible airships being made later in 1897, but nothing really conventionally was well known or accepted, even in conventional aviation. So it's at a time where there really wasn't supposed to be a whole lot going on in the air, but also tabloid newspapers were very popular. So a lot of people will contest the validity to these airship stories. Many of them sound very sensational, but there are some interesting ones, and the most notable, I think, is, of course, the Aurora story, which is titled "A Windmill Demolishes It." Here's the author, S.E. Hayden, probably one of the only pictures of him in existence. But it's a few stanzas long. It talks about, of course, most of you probably have heard about the Aurora case. How many of you have heard about Aurora, been to Aurora before? Pretty cool, most of us here. So, it's one of those enduring mysteries that's got a lot of, intrigue to the story. It talks about not only the airship crashing into a windmill, exploding with debris everywhere that the townsfolk later came up and recovered. Talks about the strange metal. It seemed to be aluminum and silver, like in nature. But it also talks about the pilot, which was badly disfigured, but enough of the original was recovered to determine, as it says, quote, "not an inhabitant of this world." So what makes this airship story stand out is that it's one of the few that actually insinuates that it's not just a creative invention of the time, but it's implying that it's something otherworldly, which I think makes this one stand out amongst a lot of the airship stories, which are all very interesting. And of course, the other interesting part is that they had a funeral, and they talk about the burial of the pilot the next day. And there's obviously a lot of interesting speculation about this. I'm regarding it as a legend for the case of inspirational folklore, because I think that regardless of if it happened or it didn't happen, we can still learn a lot about what something like a case of Aurora has for what we're looking at now, with especially all these stories about crash retrievals and ideas of what's going on with the media and the government and all this. So I think it's very relevant today, whether people contest this story's validity or not. I think it's something that we can utilize for how we move forward with this subject overall. And of course, 6 years later, you have the Wright brothers flyer. So it's something that I think, again, really shows that if there was something in the air, it was pretty significant to note that whether 99% of all of those airship stories were hoaxes or not, I think that such a concentration of them were enough to be shown that there's probably something to it, at least a few. Nothing's ever been shown to really be hidden away in some barn or something as far as we know. But I think it's interesting to consider that people were out, possibly these groups, inventors, constructing craft, but it's something we have to find more out, and I think it's hard because it's so far removed from history. Fast forwarding a little bit, you have a lot of interesting cases in the 20s and 30s, but they're hard to keep track of because at the time there wasn't really a lot. The closest that we know of are some things documented by Charles Fort, which is where we get Fortean phenomena. He was pretty big into studying a lot of this back in the 20s. He wrote a book in 1919 called Book of the Damned, which is one of the first UFO books ever. They didn't call it UFOs, but it was something that people noticed that there are a lot of stories that got some coverage. Going into the 40s, though, you have an interesting place over north of Houston called Bragg Road. How many of you guys seen the ghost light over there on Bragg Road? Well, it's an interesting light. I don't know that I would say it's technically your conventional UFO, but it is a light phenomenon. So I want to make mention of this because there's a lot of crossover, and I think it's good that Tom brought up some of the things that MUFON's doing. I think they announced last year that they're no longer investigating orbs, the orb phenomenon, which a lot of people kind of cross-relate to the paranormal and things. So it's very difficult. I took this picture. I don't know, it could be a car, but it's an 8-mile stretch of gravel road where they have an idea, a little bit of urban legend about where these lights come from out there. But interesting light phenomenon. It's been seen at least since the 30s and 40s north of Houston on Bragg Road. They call it the Saratoga Light. Interesting situation in Aurora. In the mid-40s, a family moved onto that property where Judge Proctor had a windmill and a well and the water tank and all of these things. And this family called the Oates family basically moved in and wanted to use the well, and they cleaned out the well and began using it around 1945, 46 is what I've been told. And so after a number of years of drinking the water, there's some interesting things that had happened. Of course, most of us know about the whole Roswell incident. There's a lot of obfuscation with that as well. Unfortunately, after more than 75 years now, there's a lot of confusion about what actually took place, not only just in the alternative viewpoints and outlook, but even the official explanations by the Air Force. I think the last one that they really gave was in 1997 when they came out with a publication called Case Closed, and they really wanted to kind of put an end to the whole Roswell situation. But it's a really interesting situation where people are still finding things out there. They have an ongoing festival every year. But why I bring this up is because it's not only probably the most notable UFO sort of legend as far as what's known in the lore and the mythos of ufology, but some people are familiar with this, but one lesser known thing is they actually brought a lot of the wreckage and debris over to Carswell Air Force or Airfield over here, the Army Airfield, before it was turned later. And these pictures where you're seeing here, these guys holding up what looks like tinfoil, those were taken in a press release over here at the base. And so you have General Roger Ramey and Jesse Marcel holding up stuff, and people, their families have come forward later on, and at least the Marcels have talked about how there's a lot more going on to what actually happened, and that wasn't actually a weather balloon. So it's interesting to know that some of the most historic UFO-related photos actually took place over here in Fort Worth before they took a lot of that stuff elsewhere, and a lot of people say it was taken up to Dayton, Ohio, at Wright-Patterson Airfield, and all of those things like that. So an interesting situation with the Roswell debris. Another interesting case in 49 over in Killeen, an object apparently came close to a nuclear site over there, and that puts things on high alert anytime that takes place. It seems like there could be a lot of connections with what's going on with these objects. If there's some intelligence that is curious about what we're doing with nuclear devices and armaments, some actually have come out later and said that they're activating them, deactivating them, and putting places kind of on high alert, which we'll get into a little bit later on as well. Moving to the 50s, this is a pretty famous Texas-based case. These are actual photographs taken by some scientists there at the time which the technical college. You had some people seeing things over a few days in 51 there, and eventually this formation took place, and they were able to take some photographs. And this was actually reported in Project Blue Book, and this is one of the cases that if you guys ever seen the newer fictionalized show, they do an episode on this one. The show, people can say whatever about it. It's cool to see maybe something like this, dramatized in a well-done production, I'd say. But, the idea is that people consider, are these objects all intact? Are they individual objects that come together, that work together in some way, or was it a massive delta-shaped craft? Well, one of the interesting things is that the explanation given seemed to be that these were plovers that were reflecting light off of the newly installed lampposts and things from town, like 2 miles away. And so it's kind of strange, but it's something that a lot of people at the time were very curious about in town. So this is a very big part about the Texas UFO sightings history, is these Lubbock lights. And they actually have a few events out there now, nothing like a big conference, but they have some small meetups and things. They call the Lubbock Lights Festival and some things out there. So it's an interesting case, but it's been reported in Ruppelt's book, and that's actually one of the ones I'll call upon here later on. There we go. Another probably lesser known case, the Houston Batman. This is pretty cool. This is not the Houston Batman. This is, again, my friend and colleague Ken Gerhard. He's spoken here. I actually think this is right here in the room. That's where I took this picture. He is a world-renowned cryptozoologist, and Jason and I actually were fortunate to go on an expedition with him to Bluff Creek, Northern California, a few years back for another cryptid investigation. But he's presented on a number of different strange encounters, one of them being something that took place in Houston in 53, which the newspaper, the Houston Chronicle, called the Unearthly Batman. Pretty strange case, not necessarily your typical UFO, but what some people saw one night in the Houston Heights area outside was a glowing form which turned into what looked like a humanoid person and ascended into a tree line. And they watched this figure for some amount of time before the glowing figure imploded and something rocketed up down the street a moment later. So a weird flying humanoid type sighting, which he's written a book about. And it still gets updates in the newspaper every time there's an anniversary or something. They cover the news. It's not really a very well-known UFO case just because of the nature of its sighting and all of these things. Another really strange and controversial case, the latest date attributed to it is 1955, but some things have suggested that the person who claimed this said it was maybe in 48 or even in 1950. But apparently Colonel Robert Willingham was flying in formation in West Texas whenever his wing formation saw a glowing object coming across the sky and actually took a sharp turn towards South Texas, and he got permission from his commanding officer to pursue the object. And from his claim, he goes and follows it over the the Texas-Mexico border here, where he says it crashes, and he goes back over here to Carswell, picks up his private plane with an engineer that he takes with him, so he has a witness, and he goes and he eventually gets back, lands on the other side, and he describes seeing a craft that had crashed into a hill, and there were Army members from Mexico already barring it off, and basically he said that he could walk around and picked up some metal. He saw a crack in the ship, and he could see bodies inside, and that apparently he kept some of the metal and it wouldn't tarnish. He tried to tamper with it, nothing would happen. It seemed layered, and the Air Force took it, and he never heard back. So this has been contested by a number of people. This is what's known as the Del Rio UFO. It's not really in Del Rio. It's actually closer to the border of Langtree. But this is something that a lot of people have said his military record is doesn't line up. This is all bogus. So if this actually happened, it would be curious to know that maybe there are others out there where there are objects that have crashed and maybe occupants, and then maybe even retrievals by the U.S. or some clandestine group or agency. So there's a lot going on. In 57, a strange shaped object like an egg or an orb was seen in Levelland, and it actually was disabling people's vehicles. The authorities were alerted and they came out and it did the same to them. This is Nate. He actually gave a presentation on some of these cases as well, right here, a number of years back, which he wrote a book on called Lone Star Saucers. So an interesting case. I think that, unfortunately, I don't think anyone was injured, but it did affect vehicles. So sometimes what you see is these objects have an effect on physical things, devices, electronics, sometimes people, unfortunately. We'll talk about that. This is really curious because it's hard to see, but in the same year, or a little after that, in 57, the Oates family, the one who moved onto the property, after deciding for probably a number of reasons, they didn't want to use the well, they sealed it off in 57 after at least a dozen years of use. And it's hard to see, but it says Oates 1957 on there. And I know Ken knows a little bit of something about this whole situation because they got to personally go out there and unseal it and do all these really incredible things a little bit later on. But kind of getting back into the 60s, one thing I'll mention, this isn't probably what most people would think is directly related, but curiously enough, JFK, President John F. Kennedy at the time, in 1963, on the 12th of November, sent a letter to the CIA requesting all information about UFOs just 10 days before his assassination here in Dallas, which is really curious. I don't know that that's the main reason why. I think there's a lot of issues with what had happened there, but it is interesting to know that he was interested in this. Unfortunately, we never really got to see how that would play out. So it's part of something I think that falls into this history, and it should be mentioned. But later on in 65, you have a strange object. This is the actual photograph of some amorphous shape. Keep this in mind because this is almost relevant to what we're seeing with stuff today. If you guys have been paying attention to the whole jellyfish thing, you have these weird objects that are seen that aren't necessarily appearing to be totally solid or physical. It makes us wonder what's going on, or these photographic anomalies, all of this. So in Sherman, I think some law enforcement took this picture of an object they tracked. The same year in Damon, Texas, similarly, law enforcement describes seeing a triangular object. What's interesting, though, is that there are a number of orientations or shapes of craft that are seen all over. The triangle shape is actually very prominent as well. In 66, it's claimed that 8 construction workers came out to do some mining in a caliche pit here in Edinburgh in South Texas. And in doing so, they had something explode over their workspace and scorch the earth and their machinery. And they called the local sheriff's department, who came out later on, and they all booked it back to Dallas, which is where they were from. Noe Torres, who's a resident down there and local author, has written a number of books, but he lives there and is actually a big reason why this is more well-known today. It's been documented now. He just released a book on it, and this site looks kind of crater-ish, like it's an impact site, but it's really not. It's been built up back there, but they're still finding some strange metal and things. They think maybe something exploded, and it has something to do possibly with the nearby air base. So whether it's ET related or not, we have to keep in mind that there's a lot of aerospace involved with secretive aviation and things like that as well, even at the local facilities they have down there. Interesting thing is in the 70s, local author here, Jim Mars, who wrote extensively about a number of topics, wrote in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram about the Aurora case, and it's something that got a lot of attention at the time. You can see down here it says UFO crash site, nobody here but us chickens. It's like a chicken coop that eventually got put into place just because of being dormant out there for a long time. Metal that was found was taken up to North Texas University over there, and physicist Dr. Tom Gray, which I think is ironic that his name's Gray, was looking at some of this metal here, and there's some interesting things going on, mostly aluminum with some zinc and some strange parts that got some attention there. So some metal had been found out there. At the same time, Brawley Oates, who was the guy who lived there with his family at the site, some claims have been made that his health conditions were incurred because of having drank the well water for a dozen years. And unfortunately, we can see that some people do have effects from, or health issues from being in close proximity to UAP and things like this. So people wonder if the radiation from certain objects that causes health issues is the same situation with what we see here with Brawley Oates. He's no longer alive, but his family members are, and it's curious to wonder if this is actually how he got these bad conditions. There was also a marker there in 73, right before it went missing. There was a cemetery watch. So this is what some people say is the original headstone out there. And it's not a nice carved stone like these, real headstones. It's like a rock. And Jim Marsh thought that this was half of a full stone with a carving or etching, which might have shown what could have been a full, craft or something. Kind of creative, but it's missing, and it's been gone for 50 years now. Continuing on, in Palacios, you have this really interesting sort of landing zone established after a number of sightings where they say that they want to grant landing for UFOs, and a giant red blob comes over a game, and they say, well, it's UFO fly-in day after that. So it's cool to see some towns accepting it, even as far back as 50 years ago, and how this theme kind of plays into the cultural embracing of the subject as well. A little bit after that, you have a strange issue of unidentified flying animals or creatures, which some consider the big bird or the thunderbird down in the valley. This was a very common thing. Apparently, every time I go down once a year or so to have some of our events down there, and people will always share that they saw the big bird. It could be, misidentification, a number of things, but some people consider that it could have been something like a pteranodon or a living pterosaur or something, which would be very curious to know that if there are somehow relict dinosaurs still around, how they might survive. So in Raymondville and Brownsville and San Antonio, there are lots of vintage newspapers which show some of these stories called the Big Bird and things like that, like this one here, which were seen by teachers and other seemingly credible people. So it doesn't seem like you maybe can chalk all of it up to misidentification. Something to it though. So sometimes UFOs aren't always mechanical crafts. Some people just aren't very good at identifying normal animals anyways, but when it comes to this, it makes us wonder what people were really seeing. There's Ken, again, his first book that he published was about the Big Bird, as they called it, which I thought, this is cool. We had him come out to Edinburgh at their UFO conference a few years ago there in the Valley to share about these cases, because he's kind of a central figure for a lot of the cases and things that get shared that he culminates in his research. So it was cool to be able to have that kind of in connection with traditional UFO topic discussions as well. In 1976, a historical marker recognized the legend. It's pretty cool. It says the site is also well known because of the legend that a spaceship crashed here nearby in 1897, and the pilot killed in the crash is buried here. So being that the Texas Historical Commission thought enough of it to erect a historical marker, I think that's pretty neat. It's still there. It's kind of a tourist destination. A lot of people come and want to go see the cemetery and all the stuff that's out there now. In the 80s, you have some interesting cases going on. This one's very unfortunate, but I think it's really notable and really important overall, especially now with what we're hearing going on kind of in the official circles of this discussion. In 1980, at the end of December, you had Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and her grandson Colby Landrum driving down a country road after playing bingo and trying to find some places like to play bingo and things. And as they were coming back, they heard some helicopters and saw this strange light, and they really weren't sure what was going on. Basically, they had seen something that got their attention enough that Colby, as a child, was asking, what was that? What is that in the sky? And his grandmother was saying, it's Jesus. This is actually, it's okay, we'll be fine. It's the second coming, which is a really unfortunate outlook for considering what happened next. This object, as they continued down this road, eventually descended, as you can kind of see it now, a strange diamond-shaped object that was radiating heat. It was shooting fire, flames down below it, and there were at least 23, maybe close to 24 black helicopters, Chinooks, and other what seemed to be military helicopters, which were all around this. It's hard to think when you would ever see this many helicopters in any situation outside of an air show, maybe. So to consider that these objects were with it they associated it with military. They in no way thought it was extraterrestrial. Some people could think maybe it's back engineered and all this. There's a lot of claims out there, but the thing is that these people were affected by this object. As they got in the car, it was so hot because they had stepped out for a moment. Pressing their hand into the dashboard, it kind of melted an imprint, and eventually it took back off, and this whole convoy left the scene. They made it back, and unfortunately their hair was falling out. They had blisters, they were terribly sick, and it seemed to be a bad case of radiation. They even attempted to sue the Air Force or figure out something to get medical compensation, to no avail, unfortunately. Their case was dropped in '86, and it's really too bad because, you know, the two ladies are gone, but their grandson, or Vicky's grandson, Colby, is still around. But he doesn't really talk much about this. He's not out there making the rounds, really. But it's really important to remember situations like this because it shows that people are being affected by objects, whether intentional or not. This is a photograph that I took 2 years ago of the street, and it just kind of puts things in perspective. It's kind of eerie to consider these ladies and this child seeing an object and then, you know, it burning and then you know, all these things happening. So it's accessible now, but that road has been redone so many times. It would be interesting to know. I think that, you know, there's no indication of when this took place as far as like the construction crew, but some kind of covert crew came and cleaned it up, and there's not a lot of traces of radiation now, but you could probably go around with your Geiger counters and see around the trees and things, but it's an unfortunate case. It's also weird that half a world away at the same exact time, the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident in Suffolk, England was happening, like at the exact same time, it seems, over the course of its duration. Don't know that there's any strong connection there, but it's curious either way. Another interesting case, basically not as well known, comes from a lady who shared her father's story, and Nick Redfern picked it up here in his book, Close Encounters. Talks about having worked down in Johnson Station down there, where he looked up on the top of this building and sees this. This is Frank Shaw describing what he sees as a strange gargoyle type object with glowing eyes, almost like a Mothman situation. And he goes to his car and he just feels this immense threatening fear from it. And he gets away. He doesn't tell it to anybody but his daughter. And he finally goes back to work and describes it to his superiors. And they say, "Oh, we know about this. That's why our guard dogs are missing." And really weird stuff. And Frank ends up getting interrogated by some Men in Black seeming people, saying to kind of shut up about the whole thing. So, you know, what a strange gargoyle type thing is doing over at NASA is really weird, but, you know, it's something to include. In the same year, interestingly enough, this movie about the Aurora legend comes out called Aurora Encounter, and it's kind of a cheesy B, almost C film. It rides the coattails of the successive E.T., which is like a friendly alien movie. So you find out that, you know, the people are actually the bad guys, not the aliens. So, of course, they take some creative liberties. He doesn't die, at least right away. So it's fun. You can watch it on YouTube. It's about 90 minutes long. 2 years later, another historical marker gets erected, but this time in Marfa, talking about the unexplained phenomenon, which is pretty cool. Into the 90s, a few things going on. A guy in Dallas, I haven't really been able to track down much more. There's probably someone here that might know, but this is an article that came out talking about a man in Dallas building a landing pad for UFOs near Hutchins, southeast of Dallas, which, you know, at the time, 90s were a pretty big, UFOs were big in the 90s, so it's kind of interesting to see. And some pilots up in near the Panhandle describe seeing an object, and, you know, now pilots being able to report stuff is more widely accessible and encouraged, whereas before it's like, you know, you'd risk your whole career sharing something like that. So it's good that we do see some pilots who are brave enough to share some of these sightings. That was in Bovina. In 97, it was the 50th anniversary of Roswell. It's already, you know, a little bit more than that now. Of course, the 100th anniversary of Aurora, and I think that's when another major investigation was launched in MUFON, and I think that's when you guys went in and got some interesting work done there. And then moving kind of into a little bit more modern time frame, Marfa erects this really cool rest area viewing observation center. It's a 24-hour rest stop with restrooms, parking areas, and it's maybe like this tall off the ground, so that you can actually see out there on Mitchell Flat miles out into the desert and see the lights at night. So they encourage people to stop out. Pretty cool. It was funds raised by the local schools out there. And then, something I think which is one of the most notable cases right now, we haven't really had a whole lot like this situation in a long time. And not just in Texas, but in many ways all over. And a lot of things that we hear on the news are not really recent. They're still several years old. And this case actually is maybe not just a singular issue, but has a lot of other things going on. I hear people say they still see things out there. They're still told that there are maneuvers. There are different things going on that a lot of residents have seen over a number of years, but the concentration reports seem to culminate in 2008 and the beginning, like around this time of year, maybe a little bit sooner, where people here like Ken and many others were getting together and talking with the citizens out there, the witnesses, a number of very credible people all over town. It wasn't just one or two people who had been seeing objects, and then suddenly there were a number of people who came forward and said that they saw an enormous mothership-like object and that it was being pursued. And then some people described seeing F-16s. The interesting thing about all of this is that it seems curious that the local base actually put out a release saying that they had no one out there and that there were no planes. And of course, they changed that later on to a number, at least 10, I think, F-16s. And so it's one of the, I think, most notable cases. And why, I think, is because not only have credible people coming up, many eyewitness testimony, you have the radar tracking on it as well. There's a lot of media coverage. It's very well documented. And thanks to Steve Hudgens working with Ken Cherry here and the whole MUFON team, you have a lot of great work done by investigators who have the resources and the know-how to kind of track down the people and get some good information to share and to document. I think that's one of the things that's important about what we're doing. But there seem to be some downfalls to having done that with what ended up happening afterward in a lot of situations. But getting to this point, I wanted to be able to share that it's really cool to have Ken Cherry here with us. I wanted to invite him up to kind of share a little bit about the importance of what Stephenville, what it means to us as far as what the situation was and how we can kind of look at it with what's going on today and why it's still important. So I want to give the room over to Ken for just a moment, and I'll get the video pulled up as
Thanks,
well.
Adam.
So yeah.
I'm a fifth generation Texan, so I have two speeds of speech. It's slow and pause. So try to follow after that, after Daniel, try to follow me. As Tom mentioned, I was the state director for Texas for MUFON for about 14 years. And so we had a number of cases by then that were newsworthy, and so I had a number of news contacts. I was approached by a reporter for the Associated Press in January 10th of 2008. She said, "There's this mass sighting down there in Stephenville. What do you?" And she told me the particulars. I said, "Yeah, we're getting a lot of reports from down there, so we're going to go and send a team to interview people." And at that point, we had about 50 folks. And when Angela Brown, the reporter, put this out on the Associated Press boards, and went all over the world. By the time we got there, there were 500 people in this room that was capacity was supposed to be 250 folks. So I did a talk on our investigation that went on for an entire year. We had over a dozen investigators and half a dozen scientists involved. There's this strange quirk to the story, but to make it short, the UFO hunters who were on the History Channel at the time contacted me and wanted to be involved in our investigation. And they were very helpful because they brought a budget to do things that we didn't have money for. And so that episode was so popular that the UFO hunters had been told that they weren't going to be renewed for a second season, but then the Stephenville was their last episode, and their ratings went so high, History Channel renewed them. And the producer said, I didn't know we were gonna get brought back up for a second season, so I don't have any cases, can you help me out? So I pitched and sold and consulted on 2 more cases. One was the Aurora case. And so we did make some pretty interesting findings out there of additional anomalous metal and things in the well and so forth. But those Stephenville, Aurora, and the Cash Landrum, I was able to find Colby Landrum, who had been off the grid for years. He didn't want any notoriety or anything. And I'm sorry, I have to kind of steady myself here. He said that he was smaller a year after that incident than when it happened. And that he had frightening nightmares, bedwetting, so forth. And later in life, when he was married, he would wake up screaming, and he attributed all of that to the terrors from that incident. Again, that episode is on the 2nd season of UFO Hunters. If any of you have, I can't even remember that they changed the name of these episodes as we were involved in them about 3 or 4 times. So by the time they finally sent me a copy of it, I didn't even recognize which episode was which. But at any rate, I did a lecture on the Stephenville UFO, and I put it on YouTube, and got into a copyright argument with the people who actually made the video. I mean, that came out and filmed it. They didn't want me to show it, they just wanted to sell DVDs. Even though I hadn't sold or signed a release, I ended up losing with YouTube. They favored the other people. So anyway, only recently I did another presentation on Stephenville, and it's about an hour long. And in it I include photographs of the major witnesses, Steve Allen, Angelia Joyner, the reporter, and David Carone, who was one of the primary witnesses that claimed to have videos of the craft and so forth. And also quite a few radar captures where we found UFOs. And one of the things that, there have been at least 8 production companies down there that have done episodes. BBC, a Japanese company, latest one was Netflix, and Encounters, and they kicked off their season with the Stephenville episode. I can't remember his name offhand. I had an agreement with Patrick Altima, who was hired by Netflix to go in and do this series, to consult and appear and work with them on this episode. And I'd done a couple of weeks worth of work for him, and I've done consulting for other production companies, never had a problem doing it verbally. Then he brought in his showrunner, and his name is Jan Motkin. And Jan refused to honor the deal to pay me. And so they took one of our minor field investigators and made him the main investigator in Encounters episode. But the point being, everybody comes in out of all of these shows and focuses on Steve Allen and Angelia Joyner and a couple of other people, and this one mass sighting of this huge UFO. But they came back all year long, many of them. So I include in the video of my lecture here a lot of the radar work that we did come up with to show where these UFOs were, and some of the witness testimony. Now, my book doesn't cover Steve Allen again. I started off with a case that we didn't really make public, and I had to write it as a novel because MUFON wasn't too happy with me. They didn't want me to disclose stuff. And so my publisher said, we don't want to be sued, so you have to rewrite it as a novel. But I think it's pretty thinly veiled. If you read it, every few pages there's a reveal in there that I think most all of you will recognize. So at any rate, I guess that's pretty much all I have at the moment, but if anyone's interested, we both have books over here, and welcome to talk about it.
All right.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks, Ken. So I think it's really important to see that the work is being done to try to document and keep track of all of these things, whether they're historical or things that are occurring now. At least we have a framework in place to address a lot of these issues. And I was just going to mention that there's so many more. I'm a pretty big fan of literature, especially with these types of subjects. And to give you guys some reference, including Ken's book, which I think you have to check out, which deals with this case and a lot of other ways that you might think. You'll find out some interesting other things as well. So that one, and these are just good for reference as well. There's a newer book called Close Encounters of the Texas Kind by Mitchell Whittington. This one is Nate's book I mentioned earlier, Lone Star Saucers, which he presented here a number of years ago. This one's really pretty good. It's called Texas UFO Tales, but it only goes up until 2008, so it's a little bit dated, but that's something that has a historical perspective as well. This one's a little bit harder to find. It's the Cash Landrum book by John Schuessler, who's heavily involved with that as well, and I think that's where the art was from that picture. Pretty incredible stuff. Of course, to go a little bit further back, you've got Wallace Sheridan's The Great Texas Airship Mystery. Pretty cool book. And of course, as I mentioned earlier from Blue Book, you've got the report on UFOs by Ruppelt himself. And so there's that Lubbock Lights formation in there earlier. So that pretty much concludes as far as, there's so many other Texas sightings. I wanted to mention that on the group, people share things all the time. There's so much to keep up with on there because a lot of people will continue for years to post Starlink. I'm sure all of us have probably seen it by now, or at least, or know someone that has. It'll continue to happen where someone is going to post a video of Starlink or the rocket or the satellites themselves and, wonder what's going on or what it is. And I think it'll be an acclamation for society overall, but it's one of those things that adds a little bit of noise in the field, and we have to just do our due diligence to try to make sure we're discerning between those types of things. So I wanted to thank Ken again for mentioning some of the things that he left off on, considering how much of the role that History Channel played and spreading awareness about those major cases. Because right there, as we left off in 2008, that's when those seasons picked up, and you've got a lot of other great material. They eventually came out with like Ancient Aliens, and that swept the world as well. So the idea of these issues really got out there. And what I want to do is kind of use this to have a little breaking point and thought I'd see, because I'm going to switch over to talk about a little bit more current events. And if we need to, we can kind of pause and do a quick, restroom break or anything if you guys need to, or I can just get right into it. What do you think, Tom?
Just take a little break, but before you break, as many of you probably know, after the meeting around 5 or a little bit after 5, anyone who's interested can join us at Tolbert's for dinner. But in order to do that, I'll need to get a head count of how many of you want to do that so I can give them a call and make sure they've got reservoirs. Is anybody interested in doing that? If you do, just let me get, okay, we got it. 1, 2, 3, 4. You want to go 2 down?
Oh, yeah. That sounds good to me.
Are we done?
So we'll take a break for now. We'll come back in just a few minutes and we'll get started again.
Yeah, we'll take a restroom break.